Time to start our meeting. Just a second here. Oh. Can everybody hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining the Washtenaw County Road Commission for our August the 18th virtual working session. Before we start the session, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to cover. If you would like to make public comments during this meeting, we will prompt you at the appropriate time in the agenda to virtually raise your hand. If you are viewing the meeting on your computer, first make sure to click Join Audio. You can then raise your hand by clicking the Participants button at the bottom of your screen and then the Raise Hand button at the bottom right of your screen. If you dialed into the meeting from your touchtone phone, you can virtually raise your hand by pressing *9. Once we get to the public comment on, start that sentence over again. Once we get to the public comment section on the agenda, we will unmute participants with raised hands one at a time. The chat feature on this Zoom meeting is available only as a technical support for users on their computers or smartphones. If you are experiencing technical issues with audio or visual during the meeting, submit a comment in the chat feature and our IT manager will help you troubleshoot. The audio and video of this meeting is being recorded. A link to the video will be posted to wcroads.org in the coming days. Today's meeting agenda is posted on wcroads.org, and there is a link available in the chat if you are joining us from your computer. The meeting is now called to order, and I'm going to call the roll to identify commissioners and directors. Currently speaking is the chairman of the board, Doug Fuller. Vice Chair Barb Fuller, you there?
Present.
Thank you. Commissioner Roderick Green. Moving on, Commissioner Gloria Llamas.
I'm here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Member Joanne McCullum.
Present.
And again, I'll ask for Rod Green, who was here mere moments ago. Okay. We still nevertheless have a quorum, so we'll continue with the meeting. Managing Director, Cheryl Siddell.
I'm here.
County's Highway Engineer, Mr.
Present.
McNell. Thank you. Good morning, Matt. Director of Operations, Mr. Harmon.
Present.
Morning, Jim. Director of Finance and IT, Mr. Ackerman.
Here.
Thank you, Dan. Moving on to public participation. And we now come to public comment. If you would like to make a public comment, please virtually raise your hand now. If you are viewing the meeting on your computer, first make sure to click Join Audio. You can then raise your hand by clicking the Participants button at the bottom of your screen, and then the Raise Hand button at the bottom right of your screen. If you dialed into the meeting from your touchtone phone, you can raise your hand virtually by dialing *9. The meeting host will unmute participants with raised hands one at a time. The host will announce your username or the last 4 digits of your phone number when it is your turn to speak. As with all of our meetings, while this is a time to receive comments from the public, this is not intended to be a period for dialogue. Each person will be allocated 3 minutes to address the board. Emily, do we have anyone that would like to address the board?
At this time, Commissioner, I don't see anyone with a raised hand.
Okay, thank you. And I note that Rod Green is back with us. So, with that, I will turn the meeting over to Cheryl to lead the discussion on WCRC bylaws. we've been working on. Cheryl?
All right. Thank you and good morning, everyone. Once again, we have Marjorie Dixon with us today, our legal counsel, to be able to assist us with this endeavor. Hopefully everyone received last week a version of bylaws as we had discussed at the last working session with the changes that were proposed at that time. Margie did make those changes. So hopefully we can continue where we left off, unless anybody has any comments on what has already been changed. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the bylaws as they exist after the last working session with the changes that Marjorie did. So please bear with me as I pull those up. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. And I guess, does anybody have any questions or should we continue on where we left off?
I would have said continue from where we left off is my own thought.
Okay.
I have a question on page 4.
Okay.
Special meetings.
Yes.
Should it not specify that only the item in the call will be considered?
We could
It says-
add that if
It
you,
says notice of date, time, and place, but I believe when a special meeting is called, the call has to specify what item or items will be addressed at that special meeting, and only those items are allowed to be considered at those special meetings.
That certainly has been our past practice and one with which I concur.
we can certainly add that.
Through the chair.
Please.
Is that an item that could be included in LOPs like local operating practices, or is that something that we want in the bylaws?
I want it in the bylaws. I don't want, it's a preventive measure.
So do you want something to the effect of, and Margie obviously can make the final change, but are you looking for something like subject, date, time, and place?
An item to be considered.
Okay.
The subject item to be considered.
That would be fine.
Did you say something different, Barb? I lost you.
All I said was to add item to be considered
Okay.
along as part of the notice.
How about if I say the subject of the item to be considered?
It's just like when we go into executive session, there's more specificity, but it then prevents against special meetings being convened, and it's a free-for-all in terms of what's on the agenda.
Okay, could we say item paren S, close paren, in case there's more than one?
Yes, yes.
All right.
I have a question about that too. I agree that the special meetings, when they're called, it should be something specific. Is there a vote on special meetings? Do you need a majority vote to agree to the special meeting?
I think you would. It says the board may schedule. That would have to be a board action, which would be by majority vote.
Okay, yes,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with all of that.
All right, anything else on the scheduling of the meetings?
I would call that out as one of the more substantive changes we made. The other ones, Cheryl, we might want to take a quick look at are up above on page 3 in Article 1, where we talked about changing the regular meeting of the board to the December board meeting. because the oath of office stuff didn't neatly fit in the December meeting anymore, I moved that up to the section above item number 4 of the prior Article 2, so that any new member of the board appointed takes the oath of office as their first order of business at whatever meeting that is. I think the rest of it lines up with what we discussed last time.
I have a question about taking the oath at meetings. When our 2 most recent additions to the board were made, is the first time in my memory that we've ever had an oath taking during a regular meeting. I just wonder if my fellow board members are okay with that, or if we want to allow oaths of office, which traditionally were administered by other officials other than, I don't even remember the gentleman's name that did that at our last meeting. I just don't know that we want to require that the oath of office need to be taken during a regular meeting. And I'm open to that. It's not going to keep me awake at night one way or the other. That was a sudden and I thought abrupt change.
I think as I revised it, it doesn't require it to be at a meeting. If you look at Article 2, Section 4, it says any new member of the board appointed shall take the oath of office as their first order of business. It doesn't say at a meeting. It just says before they act as commissioner, they would take the oath. So if that's what the commissioners agree is the right thing, then I think our current language addresses that.
That's how I read it.
So it isn't to require it at a board meeting. It's just the first step a new commissioner takes is to get sworn in.
Correct.
Got
Yes.
it.
Are you comfortable with that?
I am.
Okay.
Sure.
So I apologize. Marjorie, is there anything else that you wanted to point out as far as changes?
No, I think the rest of them we talked about, and if the commissioners have had a time to review them, if they haven't, then we can go through them. I think there was one on disorderly conduct that we were talking about before, and I kept a comment in there that was down on page 7, section what's now 17. That language is straight out of the Open Meeting Act. So I think we do need to leave that as is. But then I massaged above on page 6, section 14B. Towards the middle of that paragraph, it says the chair of the board retains the right to establish time limits to govern the length of the individual presentation. And then I added there, and to proscribe disorderly conduct pursuant to section 26 of the bylaws.
And that agrees with your comment inserted on page 7 regarding item 17.
Right.
I thought you handled that very nicely.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I have none at this time on those first 7 pages.
All right, good. Marjorie, do you want to take over as far as continuing on where we left off? I think we were we had done rules of procedure, but then I think we were getting into the actual mechanics of the board meeting at that point when we adjourned the discussion on this topic last time.
Okay. So a lot of this section is on procedure and how the meeting is run, how motions are put, motions are withdrawn, how the debate is conducted, how we adjourn, how we vote when call is required. So one kind of overarching question is, do we want to get into this level of detail? Or do we want to defer to Robert's Rules of Order, which we briefly discussed last time? And then if we do want to get into this level of detail, I think, the language here is consistent with Robert's Rules of Order. So is there anything that we don't like about this as far as, I don't think there's any controversial, for instance, in 19, which says every member of the board shall raise their hand previous to speaking, address the chair.
For adjournment, I thought that was more a matter of choice. I thought rules of order, Robert's Rules of Order, you didn't have to motion to adjourn. It's just, isn't that a choice of what the board wants to do?
I didn't look at that specific issue in Robert's Rules. In meetings I've been at, we've always had a motion to adjourn. Is that your practice?
Some boards motion and some do not. And they follow Robert's rules.
Every board I've been on, we do use it. The adjournment motion is non-debatable. And some of these rules are simply Robert's Rules of Order. To say that we should, unless people are unfamiliar with the rules, you always have to speak through the chair. That doesn't, if you're following Robert's Rules of Order, you always have to speak through the chair. Motions.
I think Jim Harmon's comment on the origin of the original draft of these bylaws from many years ago is that they came from the Washtenaw County Commissioners. Whether they still get into this level of detail, I don't know. We don't have to, but we can.
I'm just letting everyone know that it was discovered in Robert's Rules of Order that you don't have to, but it's up to the board's choice if they want to follow that. That's all I was saying. I don't care if we, motion to adjourn. I was just letting everyone know. I learned that in Robert's Rules of Order, you don't have to motion. So that's all I was saying.
So I have a question. Often during debate or discussion, when it's going on too long, it is in order to call to question. When we have this in here, is that going to eliminate someone calling to question so that the debate is, you could debate for hours. So I'm wondering about the call to question portion of Robert Rules of Order that do put the debate to an end and is then put to a vote.
I think that's intended to be handled by 22B to limit debate and vote on the pending question.
Right. So it says when a question is under debate, no motion shall be received. Although a call to question is not a motion, correct?
Right.
Okay.
I guess I just wonder if you really want to get into this level of detail or not.
I don't think it's necessary, but I'll acquiesce to the boards. The majority of the board. I think that it's kind of cumbersome to say number 18 should be well enough, because these are all Robert's Rules of Order.
So we would delete 19 through 23. Is that the suggestion?
That's my suggestion.
Okay.
That would be the detail I was referring to.
So we're saying number 22 is unnecessary because it's already covered by number 18?
Correct.
Okay.
It's almost in there, it seems to me like as a reminder of what the rules of order are.
Well, I know that some people start to serve on boards and are unfamiliar with Robert's Rules of Order.
Mhm.
I don't know if it needs to be, I don't know, how does everyone else feel about it? And I'm through the chair,
Frankly, this feels like overkill. I think number 18 covers it.
Yes.
And I would favor deleting the new numbers 19 through 23.
It
Agree.
doesn't matter to me. We can go either way.
So do we have consensus that we'll drop those items, 1, 2, 3, 4, those 5 items?
Yes.
Yes, I agree to that.
Mr. Chair?
Fine with me.
That seems to be the consensus.
Okay. We'll delete those. Voting. Margie?
Yeah, every member, and you'll note that I did change to, I think there was a little bit of confusion about when we're talking about a member as a commissioner or a member of the public and things like that. So when we're referring to a member who is a commissioner, I capitalize the M. So every member who shall be present, and we've defined present above as potentially by video conference, including the chair when a motion is last stated by the chair, and no other shall vote for or against the motion unless there's a conflict of interest. And then we specify when roll call vote is required.
And is it necessary at that point to point out that when we're meeting as we are now virtually, that we're going to have a roll call vote on everything? Or are we just going to let that ride under the emergency orders under which we're presently meeting?
I believe I need to go back up to the section where we talked about remote participation, but I believe we addressed it there. We could address it again.
Well, and is it under C as well? Because under roll call vote, it does say C, a matter being voted on by a member participating remotely
Yeah.
pursuant
Yep,
to
you're right
Article
with
3, Section 8.
Thanks, Cheryl. We did catch it there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I do think that that is an important thing to have in there so that we do have a clear record of how people are voting if we are going to have remote participation. Are people comfortable with that language?
I am.
Yes.
Damn.
Okay,
Yes,
all right, good. Marjorie, would you mind helping us continue?
Yep, 19B just says that unless otherwise required, a majority vote controls. 20, I would, did you, okay, sorry, Cheryl, your red line, I updated my red line to delete all those sections, so my numbering's now wrong.
Yeah, this Word document's doing something weird as well, so.
Yeah. Sorry,
20
looking at
should be
on
division.
my other screen. Yeah, so what's 25 on your screen is 20 on mine, and I would argue that that is a level of detail that consistent with the prior action we would probably delete.
I would agree. It's covered in Roberts.
I agree.
So are we at disorderly conduct?
Yep. And you saw my note above on disorderly conduct and what the Open Meetings Act says. It does provide the chair the authority to call to order any person who's being disorderly. And this says speaking longer than the allotted time or otherwise disrupting the meeting. They'll be seated until the chair determines whether they're in order. If they're out of order, they can't speak further. And shall be removed from a public meeting except for an actual breach of the peace. And again, that's consistent with the Open Meetings Act. I suppose it's a bit redundant to include it here, but it seems worthwhile since This section is on disorderly conduct. Any discussion on that?
I'm
No.
fine including it here.
Am I?
I am too. I think it's important.
Suspension, so no rule of the board shall be suspended, amended, or rescinded without majority of the members appointed and serving. Chair has a right to participate in debate. That's the next section. Oh, I think Cheryl, your numbering's still one off from mine, but that's okay.
I think it is as well, yes.
I'll call them out by the section heading since we're all right in the document. The chair's right to participate in debate. I don't think that's controversial. Minutes, we always prepare minutes. Mailing of the minutes prepared by the board secretary under the direction of the managing director. I wonder if Commissioner Fuller wants, Doug Fuller wants us to add, I think on the agenda, you had input, the chair had input to the agenda. I don't know if the chair wants input to the minutes.
No,
Okay.
we have not in the past, as far as I know, Cheryl.
That is correct.
Okay, and so those are delivered 72 hours before the next regular meeting. That's consistent with current practice. Availability of the minutes to the public. We do that, minutes of the meetings, except closed sessions, our public records, open to public inspection, available at the Road Commission office and posted on the website. Not later than 8 business days after the meeting. Approved minutes available for public inspection not later than 5 business days after the minutes are approved by the board. Is that all consistent with current practice?
I suspect that it is. Cheryl, is 5 business days thoughtfully arrived at, or is that something we just decided to put in there?
The 5 business days after the minutes are approved are not problematic. The proposed minutes, I don't know that that's a practice that we have currently adhered to. I mean, typically the draft minutes are included in the board packets.
Yeah, for the next meeting.
Right.
Which to be, that's consistent with what's in here. I'm just wondering why there would be a 5 business day delay for the approved minutes to be available to the public. Does that seem reasonable or thoughtful or anything?
That's reasonable, and typically we have them, I mean, it's just a matter of getting them signed and made publicly available, so I don't think that that's an unreasonable expectation.
Okay.
The 8 business days is the part that on the proposed minutes, because there are times when we have 3 weeks between board meetings as opposed to 2, so.
Right. So we should change that 8 to some other higher number?
Yes,
Okay, suggest a number.
that's what I'm trying to,
So should it say something more like 8 days prior to the meeting? So it's just so that it's a reasonable amount of time so that we can review the meeting minutes.
right. So
rather
really it
than-
has more to do with available prior to for approval, so that it's the subsequent meeting than the meeting at which it took place. Is that what you're saying, Gloria?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yes.
would agree with that. Does that make sense, Margie?
Yeah, the only caveat I have is I didn't check that issue to see whether that comes from the Open Meetings Act, so I'll just double check and make sure there isn't some limitation there.
Okay.
I don't know if I would want it to be before the next meeting, because I think there's some element of giving the public the minutes within some reasonable time after the meeting. And if the next meeting is delayed, then that could be quite a long time.
Okay.
I would agree with that as well. I think that it's important that the minutes be available for some time after the meeting so that the public has an opportunity to review them.
My concern is draft minutes are sometimes in need of correction. So if you're circulating draft minutes separate from the board packet, there are individuals who will construe those to be approved minutes, unless they're watermarked or somehow it's obvious that they're not approved minutes. I think that's why they're part of the board packet, is because they require action by the board to finalize them.
So is there a distinction between the draft minutes and the approved minutes? Does the public receive the draft minutes also, or are those just for our purview until they become approved minutes?
The
They're
draft
an agenda item.
Right, the draft minutes are included in the board packets, which are available for public review once they are published to the board. The only things that are not in the board packet would be something like minutes from a closed session. So those would be distributed to the board members separately. So the public would potentially be seeing those draft minutes on, it's typically the Friday prior to the next Tuesday's meeting. But they are watermarked. There's usually a watermark on there that indicates that they are draft. And as part of the agenda for that meeting, it is showing approval by the board, which, as Commissioner Barb Fuller indicated, that's the opportunity that they could potentially be modified at that time. But that's been the current practice.
I have been doing a quick bit of research. I didn't get into the act itself, but I did get into the state's open meeting handbook, and there's sort of a frequently asked questions section there. When must the minutes be available? Proposed minutes must be made available for public inspection within 8 days of the applicable meeting. Approved minutes must be made available for public inspection within 5 days of the public body's approval.
Okay.
So
I don't think we have wiggle room on that. I see the statute, I can cross-check that.
All right,
And
well,
then
that's something we may need to change then.
The minutes have to be approved by the next board meeting. Corrected minutes must show both the original entry and the correction. So sort of a red line.
So it sounds like statute dictates this.
Yep. Yep.
So let's
Okay.
move on. It's not something under our.
Yeah, we'll figure out the protocol and how to make sure we're doing that correctly.
Okay, board secretary or his or her designee is responsible for posting notices for the meetings, preparing the agenda, keeping minutes as provided by the bylaws. Interesting, because we don't really have a board secretary above. Is there a board secretary?
Yes, the
Oh,
my administrative assistant is the board secretary.
Okay, which that makes sense because that person is not a commissioner and then thus not an officer of the board.
Correct, that person would be a staff member.
Mm-hmm. Should we specify that here? The only reason I'm raising it is because I think there used to be a position for a board secretary up in the officers section, which is in Article 2, where we say we have a chair and a vice chair, and then we have members, because those are really the only officers of the board. I would say the secretary of the board is not an officer of the board, but it sure sounds like it when you call that person secretary of the board.
Sounds like that to me. I saw in there though that also it said something about designee
Mm-hmm.
shall be or his or her Yeah, that secretary of the board does sound like a member of the board, even though we know it's not. What is, could we put staff, or something like that?
Well, we could put the secretary of the board shall be a member of the staff of the road commission.
Can you just say secretary to the board and
Yeah,
not
that's-
capitalize secretary?
Great idea.
Thank you, Barb.
Great idea. And I'll change that in the heading too. Yeah. I see Cheryl's doing the same thing. Okay.
And then make secretary lowercase, the S,
Yep.
to be consistent with the other changes you've made by capitalizing member.
We need then or his or her designee, because it seems like the
No,
secretary.
because the secretary doesn't make the designation.
Managing director would.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're on to fiscal affairs. Fiscal year, January 1, calendar year. Final budget needs to be adopted before its first regular meeting in December. Is that consistent with current practice?
On or before, yeah.
Mm-hmm. No budget allotment is deemed a mandate to spend. Managing director shall approve all expenditures beyond line item allotments within budgetary limitations. Expenditures in excess of approved limitations must be approved by the board.
That's all consistent with our procurement policy.
Where does the spending authority of the managing director get stated? The cap on that.
That's in the procurement policy that's approved by
Thank you.
the board.
I wonder if we've got the right language on 4 where it says the administration shall be charged with the responsibility of following accepted statutory accounting procedures. Are we talking about the administrative staff of the road commission?
Who else would it be?
Yeah, I guess.
Marjorie,
Yep.
whom else would we be discussing?
I think that's what it means. I just think the administration is a little bit,
So should we be saying just staff?
The administration of the road commission.
administrative. Okay.
I'm comfortable with the language as it's stated.
Okay.
So am I.
All right, good. CPAs. Board shall appoint a firm of CPAs to serve at the pleasure of the board, audited once a year, and such other times as the board may determine. Copy of the audit filed as required by statute and made available at the office for public examination. And I think, Cheryl, you had your finance department review this whole article
Yes,
and approve it.
yes.
Yeah, I was going to say Cheryl shared this with me earlier, and it seems to be consistent with our practices as well as the Uniform Accounting Manual.
Great.
Thank you, Dan.
Any further comments on fiscal? On to administration. I don't think there's too much controversial here. Chief Executive Officer, designated Managing Director. Managing Director administers the affairs of the commission. And
Just one on page 9,
Mhm.
managing director, second line, the managing director of the road commission.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Maybe we should say the road commission instead of just the commission as well. Legal counsel, board appoints legal outside legal counsel to serve at the pleasure of the board. Item 3, board shall adopt written policies governing operation of the road commission. I know that you've done that extensively for employment and personnel. Policies recommended by the managing director include appropriate classification of personnel, terms of employment, compensation schedules, and the managing director keeps the board fully advised as to the need for change in those policies. Delegation of authority. The board can delegate to the managing director such of its authority as permitted by law, including the authority to select and employ personnel, pay claims and demands against the road commission, purchase, lease, otherwise acquire personal property, invest funds, accept contributions, grants, gifts, donations, service, other financial assistance. Then if we want to alter or amend or repeal or adopt new bylaws, we can do that. The board can do that. Has to be presented for action at a meeting after the proposed change has been presented as an agenda item at a prior meeting of the board, so you can't do it all in one fell swoop. The proposed change has been distributed to all the members of the board at least 7 days prior, and that you can suspend those notice requirements only at a meeting where all 5 approve. Conversation on any of that? Oh my goodness, I think we've made it to the end.
All right. Well, thank you, Marjorie. I guess, do we need to go back up to the very beginning? Originally, it talked about a resolution adopting. Is there anything with respect to that itself that we want to talk about?
The very first page, yeah, and the comment. Do we want to review and adopt the bylaws annually? Do we just want to? That I think is designed as a mechanism for drawing the board's attention to the bylaws and whether there are any changes that are advisable. But I don't know whether the board wants to bind itself to annually adopting the bylaws.
I think it
I
is,
don't personally think it's a useful conversation annually, but that's my own personal take.
I think that it's a good way of simply reviewing once the road commission, once we become, it will not be as cumbersome as this first adoption of the bylaw, but it continued the conversation so that we can stay abreast of any changes or what needs to be done. It certainly won't take as long, but I think it is a good practice to review bylaws on a yearly basis, an annual basis. That's my take and input.
I have a little different perspective. I think that Article 6 addresses when commissioners believe changes need to be made, they can raise them, and there's a mechanism for doing that. It's a responsibility of the commissioners to review the bylaws. I just don't see the necessity of every year raising the point. If we've got something to change, then there's a mechanism for changing it. Otherwise, we're good. Let's deal with, never mind.
I concur with Commissioner Barb Fuller personally.
I think they should be looked over, but not every year. I think it should be maybe every 3 years or something like that. That's suggested, that boards do that every 3 or 4 years. They look over their bylaws. I think every year is a little bit too much.
And I would argue you can look at them every day if that's your priority. At any time, you can come up with a proposed change to the bylaws, given the mechanism in the last section of these bylaws.
I would support what
Do you have any
Joanne,
thoughts you'd like to share?
I would support what Joanne says, that if yearly is too cumbersome, then every 3 years is not unreasonable. And I agree that people can look at them all the time or every day or 10 times a day. But if it's required that they're reviewed, it's not a difficult task.
Rod, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, I mean, I think I concur with Joanne. It's probably a good idea to just have some date in there we might look at the bylaws. I don't think the 3 years is cumbersome at all. If we looked at the bylaws and just made, just look at it every 3 years. That's probably useful.
Okay. Barb, would that be a change you'd be supportive of? Say every 3 years?
No,
Okay.
I believe we have other matters of greater import. And again, there's a mechanism for changes if they're desired.
And I continue to support Barb.
Well,
Personally.
through the chair, then, do we need to put it to a vote? Of
We
what was
can't
voted?
in a working session.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
All right.
And to
I have
that-
a question, whether talking about just reviewing every 3 years or whether you're talking about reviewing and sort of readopting, which is what this original language contemplates.
Well, the reason why I mention that is because the state laws can change. And we may want to, look at adopting more of what the state law has done to put into our bylaws. And it happens periodically. So that's something that can come up in 2 or 3 years.
And that's, Joanne, that's a very, very valid point. But as Barb has pointed out, when changes are necessary, we can make them. So
Talking about,
I'd like to insert
I'm sorry,
something
Mr.
here
Chair.
for consideration by all of my fellow commissioners. We have gotten all the way through these. I would like personally to bring these back to a working session certain, after we've had a chance to contemplate the changes we've made, and whether that's at our next working session and we spend 15 minutes on it, or half an hour, I don't care, would be my preferred method of moving forward here. Would my fellow commissioners support that particular thought?
I'm thinking that there's not going to be a change because 3 of us are feeling one way and 2 are feeling in another. What's going to change? And there's no vote on this. And since no vote can happen in a working session, what is going to change in another working session?
My mind, your mind, anybody's mind.
Okay.
And there may be further questions
True.
on something besides this particular thing.
I support that, Mr. Chair. If you'd like to bring it back,
I
further,
would.
that makes sense to me.
And if I may ask, just for staff's clarification, I mean, certainly we can present the final version, so to speak, of the bylaws themselves. I haven't heard any debate over those. We'll just make sure, verify that indeed between myself and Margie, we were able to capture all the comments that were made on the bylaws themselves. What I'm hearing as a discussion here so far has been really on the resolution adopting the bylaws. So I just want to clarify that we're not talking about the bylaws per se, unless Margie or I have missed something. What we're really talking about is the resolution adopting the bylaws, which is getting into how frequently, if at all, they would be reviewed and or amended or adopted by this board. Is that a correct
Right.
statement?
I would only, I'm hesitating here simply because I don't want to, the whole idea here is to allow the commissioners, now that we have something that we can all basically agree on, let the commissioners have a couple of weeks to consider what we're doing. And if we want to move forward, I would like to have at another working session, acquiescence, encouragement, or something. But yes, I think basically you're correct, Cheryl.
Okay.
Barb, what are your thoughts? Bring it back, or should we try and choose when this comes to the board for adoption?
I don't have a preference. I've spent enough time on these. I think legal counsel has spent enough time on these. I don't understand the concern about the annual or every 3 or 4 year review piece. I don't have an opinion. Bring
Okay,
it back one more time to the working session, put it on the next board meeting agenda. I have no preference.
okay, thank you. Gloria?
I already kind of stated my position. I think that if you want to bring it back, I will agree with you to bring it back. And
Okay, Joanne?
I would agree if you want to bring it back.
Okay, I would like to bring it back, and to a meeting certain. I'd like to have the managing director put this on the agenda for the next working session and allow 15 minutes for a discussion. We may or may not need that much time.
Okay, we can do that.
Would you like me present at that meeting or not?
Say that again? Oh, I'm sorry. Boy, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think I might prefer it, but I'll leave that up to the managing director. She knows how much money we're spending on this.
All right. Margie, you and I can talk about that. Just for the record, the next working session is scheduled for September 15th.
Right. And at that point, I would expect us to move it to a, move it on from the working session to being on the regular agenda. Would be my intention anyway.
All right.
Fine.
We ready to move on to environmental stewardship?
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye,
Marjorie.
Margie.
All right,
Thanks.
Drew.
Thanks, Margie. Appreciate that very much.
Pleasure working with you all.
All right. Well, next up on our agenda is environmental stewardship. And we had originally listed this topic to discuss a variety of matters. And as we started talking it through at the staff level and realizing that we have 2 new commissioners with us, I thought it was important that we talk about it, first of all, in its broader context, because there's an awful lot of things that we do sort of under this umbrella of environmental stewardship. Ultimately, where we are headed as far as a conversation that will be much more in-depth will be a tree replacement policy that I personally, as managing director, was tasked with developing by our board back actually last November. And then with the pandemic in place, that was to have been completed by May. But we're currently working on that, again, slightly behind schedule because of the pandemic situation with that, but we would like to keep that process moving forward. But before we got down into the details of that tree replacement policy, I thought it was important that this board understand all the different things that we do from an environmental perspective. That covers pretty much every aspect of our organization and every really piece of business that we conduct, whether I think that sort of the more obvious are those on the environment or on the operational side when we're out, whether we're doing winter maintenance or whether we're doing any form of vegetation removal. But it also gets into any of the projects that we are completing, and it starts really from the scoping end of it all the way through the completion, through the construction of our projects. And then also just how we conduct business, even from the office side of things, some of the different paperless initiatives and things that we have adopted. Some of them have been in place for some period of time and some of them have been more recent. So with that, I'd like to ask Emily if she could share. We've put a PowerPoint presentation together that would like to go through, and I will kick it off, but I will very quickly be turning it over here to Jim and to Matt and to Dan to assist, since like I said, this really does fall into all aspects of how we do business. So again, here we are with environmental stewardship. This is going to be a two-part discussion. So Emily, next slide, please. So for today, what we'd like to talk about are current practices. And like I said, this really does cover a whole variety of things that we do, equipment, materials, facilities, the roadside services that we provide, the projects that we conduct, as well as a lot of the paperless initiatives that we do within the office. Please feel free to ask questions as we're going through this presentation, but we are going to kind of go through each of these topics relatively quickly. So next slide, please, Emily. Okay, so Jim, if we could start off with you. Heavy trucks obviously is a huge investment that we make each year, and if you could talk about all of the progress that we've made and what a new truck would look like for us.
Sure. And really the focus here, Cheryl, and the board is air quality with respect to environmental stewardship. Historically, the Road Commission has been highly mechanized, using a variety of equipment. Large majority of that consists of heavy trucks. We have approximately 65 or so heavy trucks, most of which are dump truck in form. We certainly have other trucks, semi-tractors to pull trailers and tankers, and platform lifts and bucket trucks and things of that nature as well. They're all falling into the heavy truck category. The commission, with respect to the dump trucks, I'll just use that phrase generically, has been purchasing 4 new trucks each year, maintaining a fleet of older trucks as spares in the event that something breaks down, particularly in the winter time, so that we have another piece of equipment to put it into operation should something fail or require repair. The new trucks, let me back up. The Environmental Protection Agency mandated several years ago that all heavy-duty diesel truck engines produced by manufacturers after January 1st of 2010 had to meet the latest EPA emission standards. And since 2010, those standards have evolved. That provided time for the manufacturers, the engine manufacturers specifically, to upgrade their lines to comply with those requirements. We're now, we've gone from really tier 0, which had no emissions control, and that was basically the entirety of our fleet prior to 2013. And since then have made steady progress purchasing new equipment, purging out the old, and we marched through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 final, and now we're at greenhouse gas 2017 standards. And all of our vehicles at this point that are purchased, including the 4 that are being upfitted in Howell at this time, we're hoping to take delivery in October, are GHG, greenhouse gas 2017 compliant. These pieces of equipment have fairly sophisticated emissions, diesel engine emissions control technology on board, specifically referred to as selective catalytic reduction. That system removes the vast majority, up to 90% of the particulate matter. You can think of it as the soot you used to see with these old diesel engines bellowing out of the exhaust stacks. Removes that particulate matter, and also the nitrogen oxides, that particular pollutant that is detrimental to our air. So the commission has invested significantly over the last several years, steadily purchasing new equipment that's compliant with these EPA standards and improving our air quality footprint in Washtenaw County, and specifically the air quality of our fleet for the road commission. We're very proud of this, and fully intend to continue these investments, these recommendations to the board as we may bring our fleet into further compliance with these standards. We're not out of compliance, but if we purchase anything new, it has to meet the then current EPA standards. Any questions on the engines and the emissions control? Okay, moving on, specifically with the new trucks, they're being upfitted, think of it as outfitted, with a wide array of very sophisticated equipment attachments, most particularly necessary for winter maintenance, a variety of plow apparatus to help us clear the snow from the roadways and highways. We've also have sophisticated granular. When I say granular, that can be rock salt or sand, gravel, limestone, but in the context of winter, we're talking rock salt or sand or a combination of the two, which we refer to as mix. That's the granular component. And then a pre-wet system, a pre-wet component. And those are onboard plastic tanks on the trucks. If you can go next slide, please, Emily. This would help illustrate my point, where this is an example of one of our modern heavy trucks. That is a dump truck. And you can see the white plastic tanks behind the wing plow. There's one on each side. You can think of it as a saddle tank, and that holds a quantity of gallons of mineral well brine. Think of it as salt brine. Has a couple of chlorides in it that are on the truck, and that allows us to pre-wet the granular material on the truck at the point of dispensing it onto the roadway to de-ice the pavement. You can see the yellow spinner forward and below that tank, also forward of that wing plow. There's plumbing in there and nozzles, and the sophisticated controls on this truck allow the operator to spray a calibrated amount of mineral well brine onto the granular material, which is then dispensed by the spinner. There's a spinner on the passenger side, there's a spinner on the driver's side, both in front of the rear drive axles, and then there's a spinner on the back of the truck, at the rear of the truck. And the operator can control which spinner, which direction, very strategically, that material would be dispensed. Pre-wetting allows us to reduce and conserve our salt, reduce the amount of salt load onto the road, which, if leaves the road, can have adverse impact on the natural environment. So we're very appreciative that the board's made the investment in this type of hardware to help us more strategically control the application of these materials. And the pre-wetting makes our de-icing efforts in the wintertime much more effective, and again reduces the amount of granular salt that we have to apply. If you think about it, when we put the rock salt on the pavement, traffic's driving over that. We're applying it to a road that has snow or ice on it, and that salt breaks down and creates a brine. By adding the pre-wetting system and adding brine to it, again, we can reduce the amount of rock salt we have to apply and also accelerate the de-icing, be more effective with the de-icing to restore the condition of the road to a generally bare pavement condition. So again, that has very beneficial ramifications in terms of our environmental impact on the road system and on the natural environment adjacent to the road system. Any questions on that system?
I have a question, Jim. The spray, is that what they, you know, some homeowners, I think, can get that to spray their sidewalks. Is that the same kind of science?
It's similar science, yes. Homeowners may have a salt brine or a calcium chloride brine, either sodium chloride, like you can think table salt, but it's more of a rock salt mixed with water to create that brine, or using calcium chloride to create that brine. Very similar science, Joanne. This is just at a higher, greater scale. Any other questions? Okay, next slide, please. So with the winter chloride application, so when I say chloride, the granular is rock salt. Mined here regionally in the Midwest. It can originate from the Detroit salt mine or the mines in Windsor. As local sources of rock salt, we acquire our salt through the State of Michigan bulk purchasing program, referred to as MyDeal, M-I-Deal. Most municipalities, school districts, universities, cities, villages, road commissions acquire their salt through the MyDeal program. We get the salt, and another benefit of the equipment that we're specifying in the relationship to the environment is that our equipment has automated spreader control systems on it. So it measures the speed of the vehicle and adjusts the application of the material based on the ground speed of the vehicle. So we're able to be more uniform in our application of material. Under a given winter event and the guidelines that we follow, we may conclude that we need to apply 200 pounds of rock salt per lane mile on the road. And this automated spreader control allows us to dial that in, allows the operator to dial that in, and then the onboard equipment will regulate that regardless of the speed of the truck. We do receive the equipment calibrated from the outfitter, and we do an annual inspection to ensure that that remains calibrated. So when the driver selects 200 pounds as an example per lane mile, that's what's coming out of that truck. The calibration on the pre-wetting is the same. We use our mineral well brine, which is from our licensed permitted well in Linden Township. And so this fall, we will be restocking all of our storage tanks at all of our yards with that mineral well brine to be used for our winter maintenance operations. Again, that's a permitted facility by the state of Michigan. And our chloride usage, rock salt is expensive. So we use this in an appropriate manner. We follow widely accepted guidelines for the application of chloride for our salting operations. More is not better. We don't want to be spraying this so that it is being applied and leaving the road and going off onto the shoulders and ditches. That's not benefiting anyone. That's adversely impacting the environment and wasting money. So our equipment allows us, again, to be very strategic on where we place the material to get the biggest bang for the buck, not waste that resource, and reduce the environmental impact. Next slide, please.
Oh, I have
Yes.
just a question about the annual equipment calibration.
Yes.
You said that that's done at the, you all do the calibration, or I was just wondering, is it, especially with new trucks, it should be pretty good every year, right? Or do you see when the truck is sort of getting fatigued, the calibration is off a lot?
We don't see that. We calibrate a truck, it remains fairly constant. However, we do have the ability and methods and procedures to calibrate ourselves. We will do that. We are constantly observing our salt use. Our operators are highly skilled and they're monitoring that use. Supervisors are also monitoring the use. So if a component is failing, something's faltering, we take note of that, and we've got a great team of mechanics that will repair that and recalibrate that system if something breaks. So we are monitoring our chloride usage every storm. We report that regularly to the board. I've shared graphs of that usage, and we maintain those records, make sure that we're not being wasteful and we're using the right amount, and it's right down to the district level and right down to the driver level.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Jim, when we go through the dry run each year, I mean, not only is there the physical part of, verifying that our equipment is, prepared for winter maintenance. Jim does also go through all of this with staff itself to make sure that they too are understanding the different applications and when to use what, and of course the importance of appropriate application rates with the drivers as well. So when we go through this dry run in the fall, which you'll be subjected to here shortly, and we are looking at both the equipment and the performance of our staff.
That is absolutely correct. During our dry run period in the latter part of October, each crew is taken offline except for emergent conditions, and they will be mounting all the winter maintenance gear on the equipment. The equipment's thoroughly clean, lubricated, confirmed that it's operable. If there's a calibration issue, it's addressed at that time. It's an all hands on deck effort, and all of that takes about a week per crew, and that culminates in a formal inspection, which includes myself, both superintendents of maintenance, and our equipment maintenance supervisor and his staff, to ensure that the equipment is up to snuff, that it passed muster and it's ready to go. If we find any deficiencies, then we have those addressed, and that ensures that we're ready to go as soon as the snow starts flying, usually in the middle of November.
Hey, Jim. Commissioner Schenk has a question. I'm going to ask her to unmute.
Sure.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, it sounds like you do use some alternatives to sodium chloride, and I'm just wondering what the decision making is, or why you don't use all alternatives to sodium chloride, because the salt is so corrosive, especially to cars, and it's kind of bad for like fish and stuff. And I say that hearing that you are limiting it, so I appreciate that.
Cost is a major factor. This point, from a dollars and cents viewpoint, it's really salt is the most effective de-icing agent that we have available to us. There are other alternatives, denatured sugars, derivatives from sugar beets and molasses, other agricultural products, but those come with a cost, and there can also be a negative environmental impact with those, where those materials can consume oxygen in our creeks and streams and have a different consequence to the flora and fauna in our community. We don't have the storage facilities for those alternatives. There'd be a cost in investing in those, and per gallon or per pound, they're far more expensive than the rock salt. What we've done to reduce our environmental footprint, especially in winter maintenance, is, as I said, invested in this sophisticated equipment to better regulate the application target it to the road, so we're not spreading it to the roadside, and incorporating this pre-wetting of the mineral well brine to further reduce the use of the granular material. So we found that to be highly effective, and also made tremendous investment in storage facilities that we'll get into here in a few minutes. So we are aware of the alternative materials. We certainly have reviewed that, discussed that with others, but we haven't found that that's a cost-effective alternative to what we're using now. Hopefully those prices will come down and become more competitive to where we could more seriously investigate that as an alternative.
As an organization, though, those are the types of things we are paying very close attention to. Jim and his staff belong to various associations of peers that are doing very similar work. So as others are testing these different materials, we can see whether those applications make sense for us. There's obviously a cost component to it. In addition, as Jim indicated, there's other environmental impacts. And so the last thing we want to do is to go from one to the other. Certainly if you start looking at something like abrasives as well, now if we're just filling our sedimentation into our streams, that's a different issue. Is that a better issue or a worse issue? We just certainly don't want to be ignorant and go from just one problem to a different problem. So we really are trying to balance all of those things as we're going along, but making sure that we are aware of what our best practices and continue to be best practices in this field.
Thank you for bringing up the abrasives. When we talk about abrasives, we're talking about sand. Sand is not a de-icing agent. It's more of a traction control agent. So the pavement temperature gets below 14 degrees Fahrenheit, salt loses its effectiveness. It requires a lot more pounds of salt to de-ice the pavement at those lower temperatures than it does at the more moderate temperatures. So we will begin to mix our granular salt with abrasive sand. And we've got two types of sand. You can think of it a coarser sand and a finer sand. And we tend to exclusively use sand on the gravel roads. We've got about 760 miles of gravel roads in Washtenaw County. So the sand is to provide traction until pavement temperatures warm up to where the salt can become more effective in de-icing pavement. But Cheryl raises a good point. Environmental impact with putting sand down. That runs off the road. That sediment gets into our storm systems. It gets into our catchments. It gets into our creeks and streams, fills in our ditches, and that's an environmental impact in and of itself. So we're very thoughtful about our winter maintenance practices and those impacts and the costs associated with that. So it's a balance of cost and benefit in order to get the job done. Any other questions on winter chloride application?
Yes, I do, Jim.
Yes, sir.
Just like to have you briefly address the requirements that MDOT places on us for application levels of de-icing on the roadways that we contract with them to maintain.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This board reviews and sets our winter maintenance guidelines annually. I'll be recommending those guidelines to the board in September for consideration, and that's subject to the board's review and your final approval. As a component of that, and our road commission being a contract county to MDOT, MDOT also has guidelines for winter maintenance on the state trunkline highways in Washtenaw County. They do for the whole state. They have two priorities. When it snows, when the highways, the trunk lines are icy, they expect us to clear those roads. And the priorities that they set are really, it's limiting the amount of expense relative to overtime work. If we're talking about I-94, that's priority 1 for MDOT. They expect us to work on that road and get that road cleared to a generally bare pavement condition, regardless of whether it's straight time or overtime. And that's from edge to edge. And that's using salt, mineral brine, occasionally abrasives, again, if the pavement was extremely cold, where the salt's not being effective, and mechanical plowing, clear the road. For a road like M52, that's a priority 2 for MDOT. During the same storm, they expect us to be working on that, clearing that road, whether it's straight time or overtime. But the goal that they've set, we only need to get that roadway in a wheel track condition. So you think of M52 as 2 lanes, northbound, southbound. We only need to get basically the inside wheel track generally bare. The remainder would have a thin layer of ice or snow on it. And under overtime, let's say on a Sunday, MDOT would say, Washtenaw County Road Commission, that's good enough. You can come back on Monday on straight time and finish clearing that road. So that's the difference that they've established for us. Our board has said that the state trunk line highways are #1 priority, along with our county paved primaries. They carry the most traffic. It's the backbone of the highway and roadway system. So when we have a winter event, it's those roads that we're working on concurrently across the county. The guidelines that MDOT's provided to the state for the application of salt and use of brine are helpful. We actually favor the Minnesota Department of Transportation guidelines. They're very similar. It's just Minnesota is a little clearer on the application of the mineral brine as a pre-wetting material. So we continue to monitor that on an annual basis, and any relevant updates, we would look to incorporate that into our process. And I know that I'm stressing heavily on winter maintenance, but please understand the relevance of what we do to the environment. And we take our stewardship seriously. We're trying to clear the road, not adversely impact the environment. So again, it's the balance of our service, what we're doing out there on the roadway.
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. Next slide, please. So I referenced the materials that we have to store. With the liquid, we store those in above ground storage tanks. Our older tanks are located inside of retention basins, basically a small excavated area, and the tanks are situated inside of that. I have a picture here in a second. Emily, could you move to that next slide? So the picture in the upper right is from our main yard here on Zeeb Road. We have 3 above ground storage tanks located on this property, on our main yard property, and those tanks are placed inside of a retention basin. That requires us to manage any storm water that may accumulate in that basin and test the material with a hygrometer to make sure that it's not contaminated with salt. Once we confirm that that's rainwater or snow melt, then we can pump that water out of that basin and release it into our stormwater detention basin, which is located in the background of that photo. The retention basin rather is designed and situated such that if we had a tank failure, one of the tanks ruptured, that basin would capture that spilled material, and then we would have an environmental response to clean that up. And fortunately, in my 25 years of history, we've never had that problem. And I attribute that to our vigilant inspection, observation, and maintenance of these facilities. Again, these are all regulated facilities, and we're routinely observing performance and watching for any problems and replacing anything that may be degrading over time at all of our yards. The tank examples, the lower picture and the left picture, those are above ground storage tanks that are located under cover. And all of those tanks and any future tanks would be what are called double walled. So think of it as a thermos bottle. brine is stored inside those tanks in the inner tank, and then it has an outer tank around that inner tank, again, like a thermos bottle. And the reason for that, it provides onboard containment. We're able to forego, by regulation, having those located in a retention basin, like the picture in the upper right. These instead have onboard containment. So that outer vessel could be punctured, but that wouldn't cause a leak because the inner vessel is still sound. We also place these under the lean-to in the case of the upper left, under our lean-to adjacent to our salt barn, and they're also further protected from any inadvertent collision or strike by being undercover. So it protects those tanks from degradation caused by ultraviolet from the sun and the weather, where the tanks in the upper right, they're exposed to the elements, and ultimately those will have to be replaced. And that replacement is part of the board's recently updated master plan for Yard 1. You can kind of see the tank in the lower middle picture. That's a picture of our Northeast Service Center salt barn. And in the rear of that, under that right side lean-to, there are two large above ground storage tanks. Each one of those are about 20,000 gallons. They're double walled. And in those instances, we've even got tertiary containment. If there was a rupture, it'd be captured with our stormwater management facilities immediately behind that barn. And again, in that catastrophic instance, we would bring to bear environmental cleanup to deal with that. We've never had that issue, and we hope never to have that issue. And again, I think it's the vigilance of staff, the constant monitoring and upgrading of any equipment as it deteriorates over time. Any questions about those facilities? Our insurance pools, specifically MCRISA, that's our general liability pool, does quarterly loss control inspections in addition to our ongoing inspections, and will make observations, and if they note any concerns, they bring that to our attention. They have a vested interest in us avoiding any loss, any catastrophic failure. So there's additional layers of observation and inspection that are placed on top of our own daily work. And I'll use this to talk about the salt storage, the example there being Northeast Service Center salt barn. That's our newest style. That's probably what our barns would look like going forward. We have a lot of high gambrel, more conventional looking barns at our other yards. And then of course we have the concrete salt dome here at the main yard. We are required to store all of our rock salt undercover, and we take that very seriously. We attempt to do all of our unloading and loading inside. So we'll have a large front end loader in there that will load the dump trucks with material. When the vendor comes to deliver the material, they back in and dump the material inside the barn. The loader will stack it into a large pile inside of the barns. And any material that may get outside of those entrances, the loader operator will scoop that up and put it back in the barn. We do have sweepers at our facilities where we can use a power broom to push any material that may have been spilled outside of the entrance back into the barn. So we're very methodical, very thoughtful about containing those stockpiles to reduce runoff on our properties to our stormwater management facilities and the natural environment. Any de-icing that we do on our pavements at our facilities is also regulated similar to our applications on the road system. Next slide, please.
Oh, Jim, I had a question. I was trying to put it in here.
Sure.
Anyway, did you say like the tanks on the right, in the right picture that are not covered with anything, that's what is going to, that's the future plans, is to take something and just cover them?
Those tanks is part of our to answer your question specifically for Yard 1. And that picture in the upper right, Joanne, is here presently at Yard 1, our main yard.
Oh, okay.
Our master plan is to replace those tanks, that tank corral, that retention basin, to remove all of that, demolish all of that, and install new tanks under a lean-to adjacent to a future salt barn, similar to the picture, the lower middle picture there for Northeast Service Center. So that's the future. In the meantime, we maintain these tank corrals in their current condition.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next slide. Facilities, everything we do demands, requires, obligates us to follow good housekeeping practices. Here at the main yard, we've outgrown our facility. We hope at some point we'll have the wherewithal to construct new facilities on the property that are appropriately sized. Regardless of that, we must practice good housekeeping. And so it's cleaning up after ourselves. If we spill oil or hydraulic fluid on our floors, we use petroleum absorbent material, which we refer to as floor dry. It kind of looks a little bit like kitty litter. To absorb those petroleum products and then properly gather that up and properly dispose of it. Our staff are trained to follow those best management practices. Just keeping things neat, orderly, monitoring condition, looking for any leaks or failures, and having our facilities group or shop attend to those promptly in order to contain and manage any spills. And again, the nice thing is that we've incorporated layers of redundancy to contain spill, to manage spill, and our staff are trained and attentive to that. Recycling, we take that very seriously. We use a lot of materials, and so we will recycle tires, petroleum products like the various oils, fluids that we use, metals, both ferrous and non-ferrous, recover salvage costs for that. Batteries, recycle those, which certainly can be hazardous to the environment if not taken care of properly. Grater bits, the carbide teeth that we have on our grater blades for scraping our limestone and gravel roads, as those wear out, we recycle those. And of course, paper and plastics and bottles and cans to a lesser extent, but we also recycle those materials as well. Stormwater management, we have stormwater management facilities at all of our yards, catchments to catch runoff, convey it to our detention basins where it is then sediment can leach out into the pond, and then the water can be released at a controlled rate to the natural environment, to the creeks and streams and conveyances downstream. Those facilities are regularly inspected. In fact, that was recently done by professional consultant as part of our federal SAW grant for all our yards. So we're proud of that, and managing our runoff from our yard in a responsible manner. And again, I mentioned the spill containment. One thing I'll elaborate on in our maintenance garages, we have trench drains and catchments in the garages. So we wash our vehicles inside that runoff, which has salt, metals, and petroleum materials in it. It goes into our trench drains and then enters a large oil grit separator underground. Think of it a large septic tank. It's downstream of our trench drains, and the grit, the sediment, particulate matter, and any oils are separated and caught in that container, and then the liquid is discharged to the sanitary sewer to then go downstream to the wastewater treatment plant for proper treatment at those locations. So again, these systems are regularly inspected, maintained, and are an important part of our environmental compliance at all of our maintenance yards. Next slide, please. And then a picture of our Northeast Service Center located on North Territorial Road, serves the northeast part of our county. That Site development maintenance facility was completed late in 2017. We moved the crew in January of 2018. This is our most modern facility. It has all the features that I've mentioned at this point. We're very proud of this, and we are hopeful, looking forward to further investments on our properties to have this level of quality facility to serve the public, serve the road commission's needs and interests. Next slide, please. Cheryl mentioned in her opening remarks roadside vegetation control. We have to mow our roadsides. We mow all of our roadsides except for our highly developed urban areas and our subdivision communities. Those adjacent property owners maintain their own frontages. So we're mowing everything else. Our roadside grass mowing is contracted. It's a multi-year contract. KDK Landscaping is our current contractor, is approved by the board. We have them scheduled for 2 cycles of roadside mowing along our paved roads and 1 cycle of mowing along our gravel roads, our unpaved roads. So about May, they commence with the first cycle along the paved, and once that's done, that takes about 4 to 5 weeks. Then they do that single cycle midsummer along the gravels. They're finishing that up now, and then they'll do that final second cycle along the paved roads. We also contract on behalf of MDOT and at their expense, Michigan Department of Transportation, to mow the state trunk line highways. Certainly there's 1 mowing on the state highways late May, early June, and our contract allows for a second optional mowing of the state highways right of way at MDOT's request. They have requested that, and KBK is the contractor and will be getting underway with that shortly. In addition to the roadside grass mowing, we also get into more heavy vegetation, woody vegetation, and that's where we use our tractor boom mowers. So that's a large, appears agricultural tractor with an appendage on the passenger side of it, a large boom with a rotary mowing deck on the end. And the operator travels along our roads and can reach out and mow that more woody vegetation beyond that area of grass mowing that our contractor performs. That's an ongoing process. We like to do it in the winter time if we're not performing winter maintenance and the roads are safe for us to do this work. It's helpful when the foliage is off, the deciduous vegetation makes the mowing operation better. And then in the spring, when we get our reemergent growth, we got a really nice, neat roadside. The mowings that we've done are now mulch down in the ground, can decompose in the ground, and we find that's very effective for our roadside mowing, but we do it year-round nonetheless. And then tree trimming, as trees grow, the limbs grow out into the traveled portion of the road, and as part of our routine maintenance operations and our projects, we will trim trees, remove encroaching limbs to maintain a clear way for the traveling public up and down our roadways. We also take into effect when the limbs over the road get laden with heavy wet snow and ice. What may not appear to be a potential obstruction today, as we sit here during this meeting, does in fact become a problem, especially for taller vehicles like school buses, fire apparatus, our own vehicles, UPS vehicles, and so on and so forth. Those limbs can weigh down and become a serious safety hazard. And so we will annually be trimming trees as part of projects and routine maintenance to maintain a clear way, taking into account our work impact specifically on our red and white oaks along our roads, and the oak wilt that has become quite problematic in our region. So there's a specific period of the year where we need to be very careful about our trimming of the oak trees to avoid introducing oak wilt. And what we do, and it's accepted practice, is we make the final cut of those limbs, then we will seal that wound on that tree in order to prevent the introduction of oak wilt. And our observations of the trimming that we've done over the last 6 to 7 years have shown that process during that sensitive period of the year to be quite effective. The trees do not appear to have been impacted by oak wilt as part of our trimming practices. And as a reminder, the board did more recently ban the use of all roadside herbicide applications. So that is not something that we're using as part of our roadside vegetation control. Any questions about that topic? Next slide, please. And a picture of one of our tractor boom mowers shortly after we acquired it, mowing the roadside with that boom mowing appendage. So you can see in the lower picture, the shorter grass that had been mowed by our contractor, roughly 4 to 6 feet out from the edge of the road, and the boom mower is actually dealing with that heavier brush, that denser foliage, woody vegetation can reach out beyond that point and manage that vegetation to keep that right of way open and clear. Next slide, please. At this point, Cheryl, I think I would be done with my remarks unless the board had any questions, and referring it over to our engineering staff.
All right, thank you, Jim. Does anybody have any further questions for Jim before we change gears a little bit here? All right. So
Thank you.
if I can turn it over to you, Adopt a County Road program is something that we implemented, I don't even know how many years ago at this point, and is something that is run through our permits folks. So if you could take it from here, that would be great.
Absolutely. So the Adopt a County Road program is modeled much like what MDOT does with their roadways as well. It takes a group and they need to adopt at least 2 miles of paved primary road and clean it up 3 times a year, as the slide indicates. It's a free program. We do some training. They have to sign off on who is going to be doing the work out there. They have to wear vests and bag the trash, and ultimately we would pick that up, and then there would be 2 road signs recognizing the organization's name. And it's been a successful program. Been doing it for many years. I don't have the number of years. It certainly has been since I've been at the Road Commission since 2006, and Jim oversaw the program before that. So it's certainly been around. And any questions on that program? Okay, next slide, please.
Matt, I think I developed that in 2002, just to answer your question.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. So MS4, this is a term that a lot of municipalities are familiar with. It stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. Ultimately, this is dealing with our storm sewer, and for other municipalities, it would deal with their sanitary collection system as well. But for us, being a road agency, it just deals with our storm sewer systems. It's a stormwater program under the Clean Waters Act. It is administered through the newly designated EAGLE, Environmental Great Lakes Energy. I think I missed an acronym there. Environmental Great Lakes and Energy. So what was formerly the MDEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, got changed to EAGLE. So ultimately, they administer permitting of the MS4. It ultimately results in best management practices such as street sweeping, drainage structure clean out. We've recently done some green infrastructure and rain gardens. Really addressing water quality is one of the top priorities of making sure that it's good quality storm discharge going into our lakes and streams. And we covered that ground a little bit, Jim, in his presentation, specifically of our facilities, but that also applies to our enclosed drainage systems in the road infrastructure as well. So that would be in the urban areas, storm sewer, catch basins. In the more rural areas, that'd be our open drainage and culverts. Any questions on this particular topic?
Yes, I do, Matt.
Yes, go right ahead.
How often do we, for example, I'm thinking of a storm drain system that we would be responsible for taking care of. And the one that jumps to mind because of proximity to the main yard is Jackson Road and the storm drains that are along the boulevard sections of Jackson Road. Do we maintain that system, or is that a municipal thing for the township?
Anything within the road right of way that we certify and maintain that's a storm sewer is typically ours. However, I will give that a caveat because there are many county drains that occupy the road right of way. So county drains are unique as well. They are in the realm of stormwater. We have our Water Resources Commissioner's Office, Evan Pratt, our Water Resource Commissioner, we work very closely with, and we have identified what is theirs and what is ours, and if there's a question, we certainly work that out between our staff. We have a SAW grant. What that is an attempt to get our arms around asset management for our storm water. So we currently are in year 2 of our SAW grant. And what that does is really giving us an opportunity to inventory and get into GIS, Geographic Information System, all of our storm sewer in the urbanized areas, all of our culverts, which we've done prior to the grant, and really document those assets. We're getting a handle on the location of a lot of underground enclosed systems that we didn't necessarily have records of. So that's a really great benefit. But then it's also a little bit overwhelming because we knows what's out there, but it's really documenting and locating all that infrastructure that we are to maintain. So it is our responsibility to answer your question. Anything in the road right away on a road that we certify, that storm sewer is ours to operate and maintain.
So the specific instance that I mentioned of Jackson Road, or Jackson Boulevard, I guess, we're responsible for that storm drain system?
That's correct.
Okay. Do we, at this point, because that would include cleaning out of the catch basins and on and on and on and on and on, do we do that on a regularly scheduled basis? Or is it on a as-needed basis?
Certainly, I can hand it over to Jim to speak to the specifics on our schedule, but one great benefit of the SAW grant, in order to inventory all of our drainage structures, we had to first then clean them. So as part of the SAW grant, anything that was in the urbanized areas has been cleaned as part of that SAW grant and inventoried, meaning the lid's been opened, we've assessed the structure itself, taken pictures of it, and looked at what's flowing in and out, pipes and inverts and sizes, and gotten that inventory of our assets in the storm realm. But Jim, I guess just to answer to the commissioner's question, what is the typical maintenance practice?
Doug, as you know, the board recently purchased a new Vector, replaced a outdated piece of equipment, inadequate piece of equipment. So we now have a modern Vector to perform this type of work. Answer your question directly, we do it as needed. And if we become aware of an issue, we strive to address it, and we now have the equipment to be able to do that. Matt and I have really been talking about our future as we've worked through the SAW grant and begun to develop an inventory of all these conveyances. It's most likely that we may let a contract, maybe a multi-year contract, have contracted services clean these catchments, the catch basin sumps, the systems with greater regularity. But really, we're reacting to problems that we observe where sediment may be accumulating in these systems and it's not flowing properly, and then we'll come in and we'll address it in a reactionary mode. We want to get to a proactive mode eventually.
Yeah, and our stormwater asset management plan will address kind of our maintenance practices, so that will roll nicely into a recommendation coming out of our SAW grant. And I will mention that our SAW grant really only assessed our primary system. It did not address our local system. And our local subdivision roads, as you're aware, there are miles and miles of enclosed storm sewer and catch basins, which were not part of the SAW grant. So that's another area that we need to, again, address at some point. So as part of the MS4 permitting, we are to identify outlets for that are going to the waters of the state. So we are in the process of mapping those outlets as part of the SAW grant and updating our maps in that regard. And then the MS4 also covers all of our facilities, which we covered previously. Any questions on MS4 permitting?
I have one as well, just because it's currently part of a construction project using the instance of Kavanaugh Lake Road, where we just are replacing a culvert underneath the road, which is adjacent to MDOT's railroad. Who's responsible for that water? When the water on what would be the south side of the railroad flows underneath the railroad going north, then flows underneath Kavanaugh Lake Road going north. How does MDOT's railroad, which meanders all the way across the county pretty much, how does that factor into our MS4 preparations and requirements?
That stream certainly is a waters of the state, I believe, and
I suspect, yeah.
yes. So any creek or stream that's not a county drain is essentially the waters of the state, and would be considered an outlet point for us. So that's a great example. We have ditches up and down Kavanaugh Lake Road that run into that water course. And then we have a structure over that water course for the road to go over. We've replaced that. That's one of the culverts and short span bridges that's going to be on our inventory that we maintain. And then ultimately, the state is responsible for its own MS4 permitting. I believe the Office of Rail and MDOT have to go through the same process as we do to permit to get the MS4 permit. So they have to account for and follow all the regulations that Eagle has for their MS4 permitting.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, no problem. Okay, next slide, please. So our signal network, We've done a lot of work over the last few years. Brent and Jeff Young and all of our signal crews have converted and replaced all of our bulbs to LED on our LED traffic signals. So that was a huge endeavor that saved a lot of energy and energy costs as well. LED bulbs last longer, they burn brighter, they take less energy. I'm sure you all are familiar with this practice. Is we do this in our homes as well on a smaller scale, but certainly that was a big endeavor, and it was recognized as a best practice. And in fact, Jeff Young was recognized for his efforts as well. So any questions on that for our traffic signal conversion to LED? Okay. In addition to our traffic signals, we have a picture of what would be a luminaire. So most times, street lighting is something that we contract with DTE Community Lighting Group for, like street lights at a roundabout. But street lights at a traffic signal, if it's attached to a mast arm of the traffic signal, quite likely we are the ones maintaining that street light. So we do have street lights. In this example, oftentimes when we have a mast arm in a signalized, urbanized area like this, we have pedestrian crossings, and certainly there's a safety benefit to having those luminaires for the pedestrians and vehicles to have a lit intersection. So we maintain these luminaires. Previously, they were not LED, and we did convert them to LED, and our signal crew did all that work themselves. So that's something that we operate and maintain, and our signal crews did a great job in converting our luminaires and also reducing our energy costs as well, as you can see. Any questions on that? Street lights in general. Okay. Next slide, please. So we are a regulatory agency by nature, and we need to conform to all the laws and regulations that are on the books, and that would include our projects. And much of our projects, especially ones that are administered in the engineering department, are state and federal funds, and they come with all the strings attached, and that would include following all of our rules as it relates to environmental impacts. So there is an environmental clearance process. It would include things like threatened and endangered species. T&E, you'll often hear it referred to as. We live in a world of acronyms. And so when you hear T&E, that stands for threatened and endangered species. That would include the bat, the rattlesnake, mussels. Anytime we're removing trees, we have to be aware of the bat, and it's pup season, and so there's a restriction on when you can cut trees. The rattlesnake is an endangered eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. I had a lot of practice to get that pronunciation correct. Ultimately, a lot of Washington County is habitat for this snake, and we have to do things like best practices of putting silt fence along our project limits. Silt fence has an intended purpose of not allowing our silt or runoffs of bare soil to migrate into streams. So usually it's to protect the lower ground areas. Well, now we're installing silt fence on the total project limits. It may not make sense from a soil erosion standpoint, but if you're familiar with threatened and endangered species and know the rattlesnake has habitat in Washington County, we'll have silt fence the whole length of the job, just for that reason, to keep the snakes out of our work limits. And we have special protocols if we find them within our work limits, what to do, and educate our contractor and inspectors on how to handle those situations. And then mussels are an important element when we're dealing with waterways. So in our bridge and culvert replacement projects, or anytime we're working in a stream, we have to be cognizant of what potential mussels may be there. We may have to do mussel surveys depending on the stream and what we know about that stream. And that can be a pretty cumbersome and expensive endeavor. So that's just to be aware of those threatened and endangered species. There are seasonal restrictions regarding fish spawning and migration. They relate to a lot of times dealing with our watercourses and bridges that that have an impact. And if we're working in the water, a lot of times you'll hear that we aren't allowed to get in the water until after the July 1st, which oftentimes we just wait until after the 4th of July holiday. So a lot of our bridge projects will require that. So anytime we're dealing with a river, a stream, or drain, that would result in either an EGLE permit or sometimes a Water Resource Commissioner's permit. We get those permits as part of our projects. If we're dealing and have impact on wetland, that would be working with EGLE to identify what wetlands and what the impacts, and sometimes we can mitigate, sometimes we use wetland banks where we created a wetland and to mitigate a disturbance of an existing wetland within the road right of way. Also, we have soil erosion and sediment control. You heard me mention that previously. All of our inspectors on site are stormwater operators and certainly can identify what needs are out there for soil erosion and sediment control. We develop plans to do things like install silt fence or put bags in structures to collect sediment. And so we are required we are a self-certified public agency that has training in that. So we ultimately will manage our own projects, but anything we permit in the public right of way, they have to get a soil erosion sediment control permit. So any questions on those bullets on environmental clearance?
Matt, thank you for going through that. I know that at times that can feel very, there's just a lot that falls under that umbrella. I think Commissioner Yamas had a little taste of that when she sat in on that webinar a couple of weeks ago. But I just thought it was incredibly important that the board understand how many different environmental issues staff examines as part of just the project development, going through any type of, when we're using state and federal funds or any of our larger engineering or construction projects, even when they're local funds. And these are all different, whether they're regulatory entities and permits that we're having to pull, or at least different levels of environmental clearance and different factors that we're looking at in planning any of our projects. It is a very extensive process.
I'd like to point out that, yes, it's very expensive, largely because it's extremely time consuming. There are so many issues. Commissioner Schenk brought up a good one some time ago now about, are we doing whatever we can do to use alternatives to rock salt? Well, there's, as Jim pointed out, there's a variety of products out there. We monitor that sort of conversation. We go to workshops about that exact issue. Certainly in the state of Michigan, because we raise sugar beets on an industrial scale in this state. The sugar beet people really, really, really push their products hard. And we do evaluate all of those things constantly. I don't know what as a percentage of our total man hours per year are spent on environmental considerations and concerns, but it's got to be in the realm of a quarter of our total time is spent on these exact issues. They're all valid. And as Matt pointed out, just getting ahead of the curve on where we have drainage structures, and keeping abreast of those and a constant inventory of those is mind numbing. It's just a huge endeavor that no one ever pays any attention to outside of this agency until something bad happens, and then we were supposed to have known about that 37 years ago. Anyway, I'll shut up.
So Matt, it sounds like a lot of what I went through with you also, you kind of covered a lot of these things before. And I appreciate it. I did want you to tell me what EAGLE meant again. So I wrote some of it down, but the acronym for EAGLE was
Environmental, Great Lakes,
And energy.
and energy.
Okay, so I had one question. So I had this question early on, and it was about the beets. Because I read about it in the package that Cheryl gave me, that really comprehensive package for me and the other new commissioner, where we're reviewing information, looking at alternatives. So I know that you guys are very careful about what you do and how you do it, and wondered, and this might be more for Jim, and I thought I might ask this even later on, as you take all costs in, because it really appears that you guys take a really comprehensive view of all of these things, factoring into the cost, the damage that salt creates on different types of roads, right? Because is it true that salt has a damaging effect on cement and some of the other roads, the salt and or the brine? And
It can, Gloria, and that's why we regulate the application based on the storm event. We control the application of the material. It's not willy-nilly. We're not just spraying this for maximum effect and causing it to bounce off of the road into the ditches, into the drainage ways and whatnot. It's very strategic to affect de-icing of the pavement. And to look forward to opportunities this coming winter season, so you can make personal observations with us on how we apply that material. With respect to beet juice, we've incorporated pre-wetting with our mineral well brine. That's pennies on the dollar. Beet juice, and that's not including the construction and maintenance of the storage vessels that we would need in addition to what we already have, is dollars per gallon, or we're pennies per gallon. And it's also important to realize that the products that industry is providing, these alternate products, most of which have calcium chloride added to them.
Okay, great. And I did hear you say that earlier. I was just curious, who decides the application? Is that a formula you give to your operators prior to going out to how much, or do they have a formula already that they use depending on snowfall that gets programmed into the machine prior to going out?
It's not programmed in the machine. They set that based on the conditions. Those conditions change over the period of the day, based on the storm event, temperatures, and so forth. And so they, as professionals, adjust based on those conditions in order to get optimum de-icing effect. We, prior to winter, during our dry run crew meetings, provide the guidance to all of the drivers and operators and supervisors that helps identify how many pounds per lane mile, how many gallons of brine per lane mile should be applied for a given storm event and given pavement temperature. So that's something that we inform and then monitor. on an annual basis.
And I
Thank
think fundamentally, Commissioner Yamas has hit on exactly what we're trying to say. I mean, we are well aware of the environmental impacts of many of the things that we do, and we're balancing that against cost. And frankly, when we look at, you know, excessive salt usage, that is a cost to this organization, both in the actual expenditure. And you are correct. Ultimately, salt does degrade the pavement. So, you know, it's in our own best interest for the longevity of our roads to make sure that we're managing that. Winter maintenance is a critical function that we provide for the safety of the motoring public. We have to. It is one of our mandates to provide that service, but fundamentally, we potentially are damaging our own roads in providing that very important service. So there is absolutely, once again, that critical balance there.
And the damage is less the corrosive nature of the material. It's the freezing and thawing. Keep in mind, we apply the salt, whether it's liquid or granular or combination, it thaws the ice and snow out. Now you have liquid water, and that gets down into the cracks in the pavement. And then eventually the effectiveness of that diminishes, and we end up with refreezing. And so you get this, you get these forces on the pavement in those cracks that causes the pavement to degrade and begin to break up. So that, you know, that's part of why we need to be strategic about our use of those materials. The other thing is that there's nothing to show other than clearing the road with winter maintenance. It's an enormous expenditure of funds, regardless of the material you use. Some are more expensive than others. We're motivated. We have a strong incentive to be very smart about our winter maintenance practices and not wasteful of those financial resources, because that's competing against all the important maintenance and improvements that we need to do. So if we're smart about it, we reduce expenditure, and we're able to preserve those dollars for other priorities that the board has established.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks.
You-
You want to continue?
Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. All right, so project development, again, this is more on the project scale. We do go through an environmental clearance process, especially as it relates to state and federal funds. We have what's called a program application, and that program application pretty much tells the story of the project. It tells what the existing roadway is, what we're planning to do, how much it's going to cost, where the funds are coming from, what matching funds there are, and then it really goes through the environmental clearance as well. MDOT recently, with Federal Highway essentially requesting this change, went through and revamped its environmental clearance, and it's become a little more rigorous. And ultimately, it does the same thing, but it takes a little more time to do that. We have to look at, is there, like it says on the slide here, hazardous toxic materials, what kind of noise impacts, air quality, if there's a public park or recreation area, what impact does it have on there, what impact does it have on farmlands, and then historic properties and districts. So that covers a lot of ground. A lot of times our projects are preventive maintenance or resurfacing, and we get what's called a categorical exclusion, meaning we're really saying that there are no significant impacts. Whereas if we were to do a large scale project where we're maybe widening a road, increasing the capacity, Jackson Road, Doug brought up the boulevard section in South Township, just south of Zeeb Road. It went through an environmental assessment. That's a very rigorous process where it goes in depth and looks at all the different impacts. A lot of times in our projects that we are doing currently, whether it be preventive maintenance, resurfacing, or intersections, we go through the same process on a smaller scale, but ultimately there's no significant impact. Now we may have to go through like historic properties. The state has what the acronym is SHPO, State Historic Office of Preservation, I believe. They require sign off on all of our projects. So that is a lengthy process that we need to get started early on in the planning of our projects. And that sign off has to happen in order for us to obligate the funds for state and federal funds. So SHPO has to happen on all of our state and federal funding. Any questions on environmental clearance process, particularly the bullets listed on the slide? Or any other questions you may have?
I do, Matt.
Sure.
The Public Act 116, which I have not read, I confess. Is there a short story on what the impact of that on our planning or operations might be?
As it relates to, I don't have a lot of history on that particular public act, but it does relate to farmlands. It really relates to, are we having a significant impact on the farmland? Are we acquiring property? Are we building something that would interfere with their ability to farm that agricultural land?
Right, PA 116 farmlands are typically those that are being preserved. It's a process that they would have worked, I believe, with the state in order to sort of sell the development rights, so to speak, so that they're preserving farmland for that intended purpose. So that's typically the farmlands that are in the PA 116. And as indicated, what they're really getting at is there any impact to those farmlands? And that's really what so first we're looking to see, are there any properties that have taken advantage of this program that are within the project limits? And then if the answer to that is yes, we're measuring whether or not we have any impact on those particular properties.
So basically farmlands that are being preserved in some way or another.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate that.
Sure.
And as you are aware, in Washington County, we have a fair amount of that. So we do run into that occasionally. We do have projects that we will do adjacent to public parks and recreation areas. Our border-to-border trail projects are within a park. So we have to get a letter stating that generally the case is we're getting letters of support for our project, that we're coordinating with the park owners, or for instance, the Textile and Woodland Roundabout project is adjacent to the city of Saline's park, so that we got a letter of support from the city saying that there's no significant impact, and in fact we need a little additional right of way. So it's just an extra step. Making sure that we're working with that neighboring community or that neighboring park owner, that they see this as not having a significant impact on that park. So, okay, next slide. We mentioned this previously, soil erosion sediment control. This is definitely a concern whenever you're having a significant construction activity. You're essentially opening the soil up, you're excavating material, and it opens up a risk factor for sediment running off of your project work site into the waters, lakes and streams. So we have to control that. So that's really what this is all about, is making sure that our projects are planned properly, that we're administering it with the proper precautions. And as I stated previously, the Road Commission is an authorized public agency responsible for monitoring soil erosion and sediment control on our own projects. So anything that we're doing, we're self-certifying that we're controlling our sediment. Our road commission inspectors and engineers are all certified stormwater operators, but that does not apply to things that are going on our right of way under permit. So if the gas or electric or AT&T is working on a project, often, or a municipality as well, often is working in the right of way, and they would be responsible for obtaining any soil erosion sediment control permits. That's through the Water Resource Office. Oftentimes, sometimes the townships do their own permitting of soil erosion sediment control, or it could be a municipality that's also self-certifying. So any questions on soil erosion sediment control? Okay, next slide. Yes, so recycled materials. A lot of times anytime we're paving, I should say, anytime we're paving, asphalt paving, we're using recyclable materials. A portion of the hot mix asphalt, 25% typically, is recycled old asphalt. So we are always recycling when we're doing HMA paving. All other examples would include pulverization. So that's where we're actually recycling the old pavement, pulverizing it, grinding it up, mixing it with the underlying aggregate, and reusing it as a base. Then we're rolling and compacting and then paving on top of. That's a great example of in-place recycling, essentially. And we've done other partnerships with MSU on using different types of recyclable material within concrete pavement. Fly ash is an example. We use slag, blast furnace aggregate for our chip seal. Other examples, they've looked at glass and recycling in concrete. I don't think that project ever got funded, but certainly we're always looking at opportunities to partner with MSU or U of M or other concrete institutes or HMA, and looking at opportunities to put forth projects that will use recyclable materials. So that's something we certainly consider. Any questions on that? Okay, next slide. So another environmental aspect is for funding. Actually, it's been quite successful in Washtenaw County, where we've put to good use congestion, mitigation, air quality grants. So the purpose of these federal funds is to reduce regulated emissions related to CO and O3 particulate matter. So anywhere where there's congestion from a vehicle standpoint, and people are stopped for any significant period of time, and those exhausts are all accumulating together, and those emissions are all going up at a very specific point loading at an intersection, we're looking to disperse that congestion and disperse those emissions. So there are funds out there to essentially address that, and it has to be an existing problem. So you've got a intersection that has existing congestion, or you can use it for signalized corridors, where we have been very successful at outfitting our traffic signal network and coordinating corridors to demonstrate that by coordinating all of our signals and put them on a network, we can move traffic more efficiently and thus reduce emissions. So it could be either a specific intersection where we're doing a treatment, such as a signalization or a roundabout, or applying it to a network of signals to reduce congestion. So both of those we've done successfully. Example projects would be most recently the Baker Road roundabouts near the city of Dexter. That was a CMAQ program. And again, these CMAQ funds are a competitive grant. So we go out after these funds competitively. We have to show a project that demonstrates a reduction, and we are successful at bringing those funds back to Washington County and implementing to solve problems on our existing network.
So Matt, how does dispersion of those emissions take place? How does that happen?
So instead of waiting maybe 3 signal cycles and having a line of cars, we're dispersing that with maybe instead of a stop controlled intersection has a lot of congestion where you're waiting a long time to get through that stop controlled intersection. And then you either put a traffic signal or put a roundabout, and that congestion goes away.
I see.
That's the theory. The other one, application of a corridor, say you were going down Carpenter Road and the signals weren't timed appropriately. You might think that sometimes when you're driving down a corridor where you get stopped at every single light, and in doing so, you're essentially creating a lot of cars lining up together and all the emissions being concentrated. And so in freeing up that and better timing that corridor and coordinating those signals, you can demonstrate that you're reducing those concentrated emissions from the cars.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on that? Okay. Next slide, please. Now, here's another example of a grant program where we use alternative means of transportation. Rather than getting in our cars, we're developing a network where we're providing an alternative. A shared use path is what we often find is a very successful case for making a grant application using transportation alternative programs, or TAP funds, you'll oftentimes refer to. These are federal funds. It requires an Act 51 agency partner, that means a road commission or a city, provides a safe alternative transportation option, an example being a shared use path. Some of our most recent examples is the Dixboro Road Trail pathway between essentially Getty's Road, starts at the county park there and goes all the way up to the Botanical Garden. We're actually working on phase 2 of the Dixboro Trail and partnership with Ann Arbor Township to go from the Botanical Garden up to Plymouth Road, and also a city park that's just on the northwest corner of Dixboro and Plymouth. The Platte Textile Greenway, that's another great success story in Pittsfield Township, where we partner with the Pittsfield Township to use TAP funds to fund portions of their textile and Platte Road greenways. And it really did a great job of developing a network that most recently got completed on Textile Road with our Textile Road paving project from basically State all the way to Michigan Avenue. A great example that we talked last working session about is our work with county parks and the Border to Border Trail, segment D2, the segment that got recently completed, that went from essentially Dexter Huron Metro Park to Zeeb Road, following the Huron River there, or Huron River Drive. Any questions on the TAP program?
Quick one, just the trail in Spurrier Township paralleling Geddes. Rod, help me out here. I don't remember where that stops and starts. I know it runs along at east from Prospect. I think it runs west of Prospect as well. Was that a TAP grant also, Matt?
There may have been TAP funds on that particular segment. I know there was a significant local match that Superior Township had on that project. It did run through the road commission, I believe. OHM was the consultant that helps us with that, helped us on that particular project. I believe there are TAP funds in that one.
Okay.
So by
And we
shared
have-
use, I'm sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. So by shared use, you mean a combination of perhaps motor vehicles and bicycles, or maybe bicycles and pedestrians or something like that?
So shared use pathways are non-motorized trails. So it has to be bicycles, could be rollerbladers, pedestrians, joggers, you name it. You can ride on it as long as it's non-motorized.
I see.
So we should call it a shared use trail because it's but basically several uses that can take place, and it's usually a wider trail than like a sidewalk, which is typically 5 feet. These shared use trails, in order to qualify for the TAP funds, they have to be a minimum of 10 feet wide. And they're just as complicated as road projects, if not more. Because typically you're building adjacent to very nice facilities or natural features, and then you have even more environmental impacts and permitting that goes along with these projects. The next slide, we have our paperless initiatives. Ultimately, MDOT was a leader in the nation to essentially take our construction documentation process to an electronic format, and they've been doing that for years. And of late, the bidding process and all of our plans and contract documents have gone electronic as well. So we have followed suit as an agency that basically we have moved into the electronic era whereby all of our documentation is instead of paper files, we have electronic files. We have PDFs, and we still maintain our historic documents that are paper files, and we've gone to the process of converting our our paper archives to electronic PDF archives. So we have not only our current projects in electronic format, but we have a good portion of our historic information electronically as well. So we have electronic plans, we have electronic construction documentation. When we generate an estimate, it's all done with electronic PDFs. The payments all get wired from the state of Michigan to contractors when we are generating pay estimates. From a permitting standpoint, we do a lot of this electronically. We moved to a new system a few years ago for our transportation permits, and it's the name of it's called Oxcart, and that's all done electronically as well. And a number of road commissions in Michigan have moved to Oxcart, and that's a great thing too, because when you're doing transportation permits and moving goods and equipment between counties and between jurisdictions, oftentimes we may do it a little differently. If we're all using the same system and it's electronic, it makes it a lot easier for those commercial folks that are in the transportation industry. And we're exploring ways to do our permitting more electronics and online as well. We've done that in a good portion of our work is being done electronically. But we still have a little bit of paper, and we're looking ways to improve things online. The pandemic has obviously had us do things more electronic than we were previously, and so we're looking at best ways to move forward our right-of-way permitting process as well. We'll also do electronic billing and payment, and I will refer to that, Dan, if you want to take that last bullet. I don't want to steal any thunder from you.
Paperless Initiatives is a real passion of mine, and it may not have the impacts that Matt and Jim were talking about earlier, but it is significant as far as the amount of paper that we're printing, that we're going through. toner, electricity, and so on. And, with the ability we have with Precision, our enterprise software, we can print a majority of things to the screen. So there's the opportunity to review things and then very easily save it as a PDF. Of course, electronic storage is something that really has come a long way, and the PDFs really have very little impact as far as the storage capacity that we have. So a number of years ago, I challenged the finance department, what reports do we actually really need? For instance, I have a monthly detailed trial balance report that's over 400 pages. And just as a course of doing business, I would print that out every month and very rarely refer to it. So, so I thought, why do I need to print this every month? Why can't I just save it as a PDF? And I challenged each of the folks in the finance department to really just look at things that we absolutely positively have to print. And, and I know the other departments have done this as well. In a recent initiative, we had a lot of our employees said, well, most of them, or actually 100% are on direct deposit now. And we were providing paper check stubs every 2 weeks. And so our employees said, well, we really don't need this excess paper. So now we're either emailing or there's a way through the electronic timekeeping for employees to view, and if they needed to print the check stubs. But that, that was a nice savings that we had. And as Matt mentioned with permits, that used to be kind of an offline venture. And then when we brought Precision in, they were able to do a majority of that through our enterprise software. So again, saving all the paper we had with it being kind of offline. And another thing I want to mention too is our service requests. So when a citizen had a service request, we would take in the information, print it out, put it in the foreman's box. And now that we have See-Click Fix, all that's done electronically. So it's more efficient and we're saving on paper. So, the goal, I have a goal of, completely paperless. Unfortunately, I don't think that'll ever happen. I think we still need some sort of paper, but I would estimate we're saving between 50 to 100,000 pieces of paper that we're not printing per year. So, and that, that does add up. Again, maybe not as impactful as some of the things that were discussed earlier, but it is important. And, reducing our carbon footprint is something that I think is important to everybody.
I will also say that having these documents electronically also, it makes it a lot easier to be clear and transparent because we're documenting everything. And when someone asks for information under the Freedom of Information Act request comes in, we can just send a PDF and say, here you go. And it's a lot easier for the public to get documentation from us. And from an auditor standpoint, we go through audits in construction, much like our finance department gets audited on a yearly basis. We get audited by MDOT and Federal Highway, and having those electronic documents makes life a lot easier. So it's very clear, open book when you just point them to a directory. So.
And it certainly facilitates working remotely.
That it does. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Next slide. I think that's questions. We're at the end.
All right. Well, I very much would like to thank Jim and Matt and Dan for putting all that information together. I thought it was very important for the board to understand sort of that broad umbrella of environmental stewardship. Clearly, we perform a lot of functions, a lot of variety of functions, but fundamentally, those are questions, just like Dan said, I challenged my staff. Well, those are the types of questions we are asking of our staff routinely. Can we do this better? Is there a new product that's out there that we should be looking at? We're not going to just randomly adopt something, but does it make sense for our organization? Is it cost effective? Is it environmentally moving us in the right direction? So that's just sort of a basis of how we believe it's important and responsible to be doing business, especially within our county, and knowing how important the environmental values are to our county. So Emily, if we could go to the last slide. So, like I said, this was part one, trying to give you a sort of a general overview of just how broad this topic is of environmental stewardship for us. So staff's intent will be at the next working session on September 15th. We'll specifically drill this topic down to trees, which again, as you'll see, actually is a little broader topic than simply the tree replacement, which is a discussion that came up for us last year and that obviously we will continue to have at the next working session. So we'll talk about what our current practices are with respect to trees, sort of in that broader context. And then as we talk about things like tree replacement, we can certainly look at what some of our peers are doing and what recommendations staff and others would have as we're moving forward. So are there any general questions? I know that was a lot of information that we just went through. All right. Well, Commissioner Doug Fuller, I think that staff is done with the information that we were hoping to share.
And fine. Do we have anybody that wanted to address the board?
Commissioner, we
point?
did have somebody raise their hand after public comment period had ended, but I was able to resolve their issue in the chat, and our project manager, they had some concerns about a driveway approach on one of the projects in Augusta Township that we're working on right now. And so I've already contacted the project manager, and the project manager has actually already contacted that resident and is scheduled to meet with them. So we were able to resolve his concerns.
Thank you. In which case I would like to have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I hear a motion. Do I hear a second?
I think Commissioner Green's trying there.
Second, sorry.
Thank you. Been moved and seconded, and that will that will require, there was the adjective I was looking for, a roll call vote. Commissioner Barb Fuller,
Yes.
Commissioner Rod Green,
Yes.
Commissioner Gloria Yamas,
Yes.
and Doug Fuller votes yes. I believe we are adjourned, and we'll see you back at 1 o'clock.